The sequester. You've heard that fancy word for budget cuts, no doubt, and you've probably heard bad things about it. But there's one big piece of good news in all the bad news. If the sequestration cuts happen, they might slightly curtail defense spending. Now you're probably thinking, slightly. What's Sirota mean by slightly? After all, for the last few months, we've all been told that if any defense spending cuts happen, it means apocalypse. It means the undead corpse of Osama bin Laden is going to be suddenly reanimated and come back and haunt us all. And there'll be terrorists running around in the streets. And basically, the world's going to end. You've heard these stories. You've heard them all throughout the media. The Republicans, for instance, are predicting crippling job losses from any defense cuts whatsoever. Defense contractors, for instance, argue that sequestration cuts are, quote, irresponsible because they will, quote, shatter our ability to execute the U.S. national security strategy. Meanwhile, the Republican chairman of the House Armed Services Committee says budget cuts, quote, would devastate our armed forces. While outgoing Defense Secretary Leon Panetta says that, quote, instead of being a first-rate power in the world, we would become a second-rate power if these budget cuts were allowed to happen. Panetta then had the gall to claim that anybody who supports such cuts are trying to, quote, deliberately hurt this country. Now, first and foremost, it's worth noting that it's laughable that any Republican who claims government spending cannot create jobs then turns around and opposes government spending cuts for the Pentagon on the grounds that it will eliminate jobs. You can't have it both ways. But whether or not you find that Republican incoherence disgusting or not, there's still a big question. Are all the apocalyptic predictions true? Will the world really end if defense spending is cut? Let's start with the jobs argument. How big will the job losses be? And could they be prevented? It's a fair question. The answer to that comes from a new study by the liberal-leaning Center for International Policy, and which was supported by the conservative Cato Institute. So it's a bipartisan, transpartisan study. Responding to defense industry claims that sequestration will kill 1 million U.S. jobs, the study finds that number is, quote, exaggerated by double or triple. On top of that, those lawmakers who claim to oppose sequestration because they're worried about jobs, they could simply work to change spending priorities to mitigate those Pentagon job losses. How? By backing increased spending on social programs that data shows create far more jobs per dollar than Pentagon expenditures do. That's right. The government's own data shows that out of all the ways to spend money, Pentagon spending is the least efficient way to create jobs. Then there's the national security argument. You know this one. Basically claims that regardless of their effect on jobs, the sequestration cuts to the Pentagon budget are so big that they represent a radical assault on America's ability to defend itself. To know that claim is absurd is to behold this graph from a new report by the nonpartisan Center for Strategic and International Studies. Look at this graph. It tells the whole story. As you can see, while it's true that annual Pentagon spending would drop 31% if sequestration cuts happen, those are comparatively small for a post-war period. After Vietnam, there was a 33% decline in defense spending. After the Cold War, there was a 36% drop. And after the Korean War, there was a 43% drop. In other words, despite America closing out right now the longest continuous era of war in its history and one of the biggest national security buildups ever, sequestration means Pentagon spending would still only face the smallest post-war reduction in more than a half century. The result, says Ronald Reagan's former Assistant Secretary of Defense, Larry Korb, he says, the result would be a defense budget leaving the United States, quote, still spending more than the next 14 nations in the world combined, most of whom are our allies. In historical terms, he adds, quote, spending would still be higher in inflation-adjusted dollars than the Cold War average. This, despite the fact that we're facing a threat that most would agree is no bigger than that of a nuclear-armed Soviet Union. Considering all these truths about how immense the Pentagon will still be, why do we still keep hearing the apocalyptic rhetoric about budget cuts? The Pentagon budget right now is so wasteful that auditors lost track of $1 trillion. How can anyone look at that fact and yet still claim any cuts are disastrous? Well, as always in politics, the answer can be found by following the money, specifically defense contractor money. As USA Today recently reported, The last decade has been an unprecedented jackpot for the private corporations that end up being the recipients of so much Defense Department cash. Those companies' profit margins, their campaign contributions, their lobbying, their think tank underwriting, all of that makes that industry by far the most powerful pillar of the power structure that undergirds Washington and the political media. All that power translates into prefabricated political consensus, one that pretends any change of the status quo would be a full-scale catastrophe. In a sense, that illusion is a preemptive kind of disaster capitalism. It pretends there would be a disaster unless military profiteering is allowed to continue at its present levels. But as retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Schaefer told the Washington Business Journal, America has to reject the propaganda of a defense industry that he says is, quote, addicted to money. Arguing that there are, quote, tons of cuts we can still make, he says we've got to look at, quote, what's best for the country, not what's best for some of these defense contractors. Doing that doesn't mean supporting the whole sequestration. Lord knows there are plenty of reasons to oppose the government-wide package of spending cuts. But what it does mean is that we need to acknowledge that the specific defense cuts in that sequestration package are anything but radical. They're the least we should be doing to prevent a new era of permanent war.